Governor Quinn floats a new borrowing plan, and Illinois schools see a spike in teacher layoffs. That's up next on Capitol View. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Bob Gough, editor of the QuincyNews.org. Bob, thanks for coming today.
Thanks, Jamey.
And Charlie Wheeler, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois at Springfield, and also a longtime Statehouse reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. Charlie, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
And Scott Reeder, managing editor of Illinois Statehouse News. Scott, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
I'd like to kick off the show just talking a little bit about this borrowing plan that Governor Quinn floated this week. He's looking for about $1.75 billion in borrowing to pay Medicaid costs. Hopefully we can capture some new or some federal funding with that is what Quinn is hoping. And he wants to pay for some employee health insurance coverage that we didn't pay for this fiscal year. Have you guys looked into this plan at all? What's your take on it?
Well, I think that it makes a lot of sense to try and pay off as many of the Medicaid bills as we can before June 30th, because the feds are giving us more money to reimburse us for the bills that we are paying than they have historically. But that additional reimbursement runs out on June 30th. So the more spending we can get in to pay the Medicaid bills, which we owe to medical providers for health care they provided to eligible recipients, the more money we can spend, the greater reimbursement we'll get back from the federal government.
And that
after
higher
June
reimbursement,
30th,
I'm sorry, Charlie.
I was going to say it, and it amounts to something like $175 million in money that the state will leave on the table if it doesn't pay these bills until after June 30th, when the Medicaid match from the federal government goes back to 50 cents on the dollar.
This was a one-time deal, started off as part of
the economic stimulus,
yeah.
Yes.
So the plan's not really clear, though. For short-term borrowing, would we have to pay this back possibly by the end of the fiscal year? Does Quinn have to have the legislator's approval to do this?
It depends on how he chooses to do that. If he does the traditional way of doing borrowing, where you go out and sell bonds, you have to have a 3/5 majority to authorize that, and you pay it back over a period of years, typically 25, 20, 30 years, something like that. Initially, he was talking about a larger package in the neighborhood of $8+ billion to be paid off over 14 years. The state also has the option of doing short-term borrowing, either within the course of the fiscal year, and there really wouldn't be time within this fiscal year to do it, I wouldn't think, to go out and sell the bonds and get them repaid before June 30th, or over several fiscal years you can do it to make up for a revenue shortfall. Either of those two alternatives would not require the legislature to approve it, but rather it would require the comptroller and the treasurer, both of whom are now Republicans, to sign off along with with the request of the Democratic governor.
And Republicans have said pretty vocally, we're not interested in doing more borrowing right now until we sort out the budget a little bit. So does this look like an issue that can go anywhere, Scott? I mean, the 8.75 seems to be a no-go, but what about this smaller number?
You know, there's some merit, as Charlie said, to the concept, but I think part of the problem is things got really, the Republican caucuses got pretty sour on things. I mean, there were a lot of things leading up to it, but after the lame duck vote on a tax increase, my sense is the well is poisoned enough that I don't think they're going to help a lot with the governor's office wanting to do the borrowing. I'd be surprised if it happens this year, but I may be in the minority on that view. But I personally think, wow, there may be some fiscal sense to it. Politically, I think it's going to be a really tough road to hoe.
Bob, you're in touch with kind of the local feel on these things. These large borrowing packages that keep coming forward, can they be explained to voters well, and is there any appetite for them?
Senator John Sullivan of Rushville sent out an email to about 300 different entities throughout West Central Illinois, all of whom are owed money by the state. He did that last week, and he tried to pitch it to the fact that, yes, I'm going to support this borrowing plan. I need you to show your support as well so we can get you paid back. And the providers, of course, want the money, but the taxpayers and the citizens are still very leery of this, even though they're looking at reductions in services and some of the cuts that are going on in schools, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. I think they want to see more of they still want to see more fiscal restraint from the government before they're going to sign off on any of this the borrowing. Even though Senator Sullivan put out a letter saying hey, this is why we need to do this, but then he also took the shot at the Republicans at the end, saying, look, they have no ideas, they're just saying no. So it's I just don't think there's the appetite there in the public for that right now.
And
See,
so,
and I look at it, I think it's just exactly what Scott said. It makes perfect fiscal sense. But politically, here's an issue where you can hammer the governor. He's tax and spend, and now he wants to borrow. And it kind of glosses over the reality of the situation. We already have borrowed, as I've said on this show and in other arenas over and over again until I sound like a broken record. We have borrowed this money from people who in good faith have provided goods and services, and we have stiffed them, we being the state of Illinois. And so in essence, we're borrowing money from them. And what Quinn is suggesting is that we borrow money from the guys who are in the business of making loans. And what's to me is even more amazing is that people would decide, okay, if we pay the bills we owe in a timely fashion, we can pick up $175 million in free money from the federal government. If we don't pay them, we lose that $175 million. I mean, the notion that to try and make some political gain, we'd throw away $175 million and then call ourselves fiscal conservatives strikes me as ludicrous.
Well, I think on the smaller amount, I think, with the Medicaid issue, yeah, that makes sense. I think when you're looking at the other items, though, that's where people start to look at it when you're talking about the big $6 billion ticket. Sure, the Medicaid thing makes sense because you can pick up that $175 million bump. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
now half of this borrowing would go to pay for employee health care that we basically didn't pay this fiscal year. The fact that we weren't able to pay that this year, does that indicate that a change may be coming as far as employee health care and what employees are expected to contribute? There's been a lot of talk of that.
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think a lot of it depends on what the union contracts say. And I'm not an expert on the contract language, but I think you're seeing in states all across the country, and in my job, I work with reporters in a lot of different states, and we're seeing enormous pressure being put on employee health care costs, and that's a huge issue right now in Wisconsin. I mean, it gets overshadowed by some of the collective bargaining issues,
right.
But employee health care costs being passed on to employees is a big part of what we're seeing happening in Wisconsin right now. And yeah, I think we're going to see over time enormous pressures to do that because the cost of health care is just going up astronomically. We all know that. And the question is, how much of the burden should be carried by the employer, in this case the state of Illinois, and how much by the employees?
And I think, this is something at the local level when you talk about the cost of health care. It costs the city of Quincy, for example, about $300,000 a month for its employee health package. But the city employees themselves pay nothing for their premiums. Zero. That is just not going to fly anymore. And Adams County is the same way, though. And, you've got a Democratic-controlled city council in which the employees pay nothing on their premiums. And then you have a Republican-controlled county board where the employees pay nothing on their premiums. Now, they have to pay for their share for dependent care and the like. But those days of those kind of plans just aren't realistic anymore. And the city, I think, has a tremendous opportunity because their union contracts are all up about getting it tied into the collective bargaining. Sure. Like you say, hey, you didn't get any raises last year, but sure, we're willing to go 3 years and maybe a 2.5 for your 3 years. But guess what? You're going to have to start paying $50 a month toward your health care. I don't think that is out of line for the city to ask. But the problem is the city's not even asking for that right now.
Yeah.
Well, and there are a lot of hurdles as far as bargaining and negotiating with unions. But it looks like the state legislature is probably going to look at least retiree health care first. They're looking at, they're having a study to have people maybe pay on a sliding scale based on how much they make. So that might be a starting point for that issue.
Yeah, I would expect to see something like that happening this spring, where particularly people who are retired and not yet of Medicare age, where the federal government picks up a big chunk of the health care cost, they will be asked to kick in something for their premiums.
Charlie, is that something that could be done legislatively, or would that require bargaining? How would that happen if it were to happen?
I suspect it would be done legislatively. I'm not sure whether once you've retired, and I honestly don't know if, for example, someone who'd worked for as an employee covered by Ask Me for so many years then retires, I don't know if they're still part of the Ask Me unit or not. I know in my case, I worked for the Sun-Times for 24 years. I was a member of the Chicago Newspaper Guild, and I still am. I'm a lifetime member. After you've been there a while, you become a lifetime member. And so whatever guild-related things would affect me, they would still affect me. But I don't know if that would be the case with state employees, most of whom belong to Ask Me, but a number of whom belong to service employees or, dozens of other unions that have smaller chunks of the state workforce within their representation.
And that seems to be part of the budgeting process this year for Quinn and the legislators. A lot of these plans that they're pitching, there's a lot of sorting out the logistics. They're not really sure on a lot of these issues that have been put forth. So, Bob, you touched on something that I'd like to talk about a little bit more. School districts are seeing a lot of teacher layoffs. Layoffs spiked last year. There was a report that came out last week saying that layoffs have spiked in the last year or so. Bob, you've been covering this in your area. Can you talk a little bit about what's been going on?
Well, over the last 4 years, the Quincy School District has had to lay people off because of budgetary reasons. Now, Charlie and I were talking earlier about how, it's kind of been a tradition. It's an annual thing. It's actually been going longer than that. But in Quincy, they've actually reduced quite a few of these positions and not refilled them eventually. Although there was one teacher on this list that was issued last night that had been released last year, was called back, had the job this year, and then got released again.
Just to pull back a little bit and to explain to viewers, school districts often will send out layoff notices when they're not sure of their budgets, and then they call people back. This happens almost every year.
Sure, but in this case, the last 2 years, Quincy had not called back of the majority of the people. So the cuts had actually been a little more real, I guess is the right term to use. And then the school district is doing this again, saying, okay, this is $1.8 million that we're cutting from the budget. I think the Quincy School District budget's about $70 million. So they had that all happen last night. And, again, it's the state, of course, is behind in what it owes to the Quincy School District, and that's the reason that they're using this for the justification. But then again, they are also, the labor negotiations will begin pretty soon as well. So they're trying to do all this in the backdrop of these cuts and what's going to happen down the road. As one of the things that a lot of the people in Quincy are upset about is they don't see cuts at the administrative level. Now, the district has made some cuts at the administrative level, but they have not been to the degree that the cuts have been made from the rank and file teachers or some of the other administrative type positions they've had. So that's been a point of contention. But last night's cuts did include some secretaries and some receptionists and things like this. So it was more than just the teachers took the bulk of it, but still no administrative cuts. And that's something that I think people are looking at is a reduction in those people. And of course, the administrators are the ones who make the bigger dollars as well.
Well, and Governor Quinn has proposed eliminating the offices of regional education. He's proposed school consolidation. He's definitely proposed some cuts to administration. Whether they're realistic or not, though, Scott, we were talking about this a little bit earlier.
Well, I mean, part of the issue is, with the regional offices of education, as Charlie was pointing out before we spoke, they used to have 102 ROEs in Illinois, and I think they're down to around 40, 45. So there's been consolidation there, and their role is primarily to do state-mandated stuff. So if they aren't doing it, somebody else will be doing it. And it's a question of, are we going to push that cost off onto local districts to be in compliance with state mandates and that sort of thing? Or are those districts going to get reimbursed for those things? It would seem to me it's basically more of an issue of who's going to pay for it, the state or for local districts. And either way, the taxpayers are going to end up paying for it.
Yeah, and there was one suggestion even that all of the stuff that the Regional Office of Education do, have it all move back to the State Board of Education, have the State Board of Education do it. But again, it's, as Scott said, these are things that are mandated, that are required. Testing school bus drivers, for example. Somebody has got to do it, unless we decide, okay, we're not going to worry about that anymore, which
Well,
I don't think is
teacher
reasonable.
certification, a lot of those
Sure.
administrative
Yeah.
issues.
And so somebody's got to do it, and who's going to do it? Are you going to try and impose every local school district to do its own? That wouldn't be very efficient. Are you going to try and move it up to the state and add people at the State Board of Education, the Office of Education, to handle these responsibilities? It's just, I don't think it's a very well thought out plan.
Well,
And I mean, in the governor's budget, people said, well, if the locals want it, let them pay for it. That was David Vaught's response.
And of course, the other thing is you're not going to get immediate savings from it because, you know, as we know, the state constitution does not allow for reduction of an elected official's salary. Well, if you you could eliminate those positions after their terms are up, and I believe there's staggered terms. Or you could, but you're not going to be able to do that right now. It's not going to help this year's budget to do it because those are people serving right now. Now, arguably, you could eliminate some of the support staff and do consolidation of the staff, but then you end up with a lopsided situation where you have two elected officials overseeing the same staff. I mean, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I guess in my mind at least.
Well, Scott, I think you brought up a good point, too, that a lot of the things that they handle are mandated by the legislature.
Sure.
Quinn hit Senator Brady pretty hard during the election on, you know, your cuts are going to raise property taxes. But then it looks like a lot of things that he's doing could possibly raise local property taxes. Was that disingenuous at the time, or?
Well, I think you're right. If the cuts that he proposed have actually come to take place, yeah, it will result in local school districts being under pressure to come up with money to pay for this. And it could be property taxes or it could be something else. One of the things he proposed, for example, was basically cutting in half the money that the state sends out to local school districts to pay for transportation, the yellow school buses. Now, a local school district still has to run those buses. The school district still has to buy diesel or natural gas or gasoline, whatever they use to power those buses. They still have to pay the drivers. So they have a couple choices. They can raise their property tax levy to cover it, or they can tell parents, okay, you're going to have to pay to have your kid ride the bus anymore. That would be another option. I don't see either of those working.
Well, the flip side of that, as David Vaught said when they presented the budget, was we have to cut somewhere. There are places that we have to make cuts. We're cutting these things in education because we want to fund early childhood education. We want to increase the foundation level. Is it a one or the other argument? Is that a fair argument? I mean, we have to find savings somewhere. Are there savings in education that are doable?
It is, in a sense, facing the size of the budget problems that Illinois has. The size requires that you go into those areas where there are big dollars to be involved. The Senate Republicans came out with a plan, and one of the things that they would do is eliminate additional money that's sent to school districts that have large numbers of low-income students, the so-called poverty grants. They would do away with that. So that would be one option that would save a lot of money. Reducing transportation costs might be another option. But if you want to save big bucks, you have to look at education, you have to look at healthcare and human services. It's just that's where the dollars are. And some of the Republican things, you know, really sound good. We should get rid of half the cell phones that we have for the state and half the cars we let people drive home. You do that and you'd save in the tens of millions of dollars. And don't forget that $1 billion is 1,000 million. So when you're saving in the tens of millions, you're really not making a lot of headway towards a $6 billion or $7 billion or what the Republicans said could be a $12 billion deficit.
Also on the education front, the University of Illinois Board of Trustees voted to raise tuition for incoming freshmen. They did this last year as well. It's not really anything new, but they are the first public university to decide to raise tuition this fiscal year. It looks like many other universities will likely follow suit because they are getting flat funding from the state. What does it mean for our public university system if we keep flat funding but continue to raise tuition for students? Can we fairly call it a public university system? Charlie, I feel like you may want to comment on this.
I should confess, obviously, that I have a conflict of interest because
I do
work
as well.
for
We're
the
both
University of Illinois.
employed by the University of Illinois at Springfield.
The thing that I worry about as you keep increasing tuition, particularly at the University of Illinois, which despite what some legislators might think or wish, is in fact a world-class institution of which we should all be very proud. And I'm not, the Springfield campus is not a world-class institution, but in Champaign-Urbana, there is a world-class institution where the contributions it's made just in science and technology alone have helped shape the modern world. And we should be proud of that. We should try to maintain it. And to do that, you have to pay to attract the top talent, the faculty. And as you meet those costs, you have to come up with the dollars from somewhere. But my concern, what I was trying to get at initially, would be as the tuition increases, the ability of the average student, even the very bright, talented kids, to pay for the university is going to be eroded unless you have financial aid to match it so that the cream of the crop who aren't the, what would you say, in the upper middle class or the rich kids, so that they'll still have the opportunity to get that kind of an education. And I think that concern was raised at the Board of Trustees meeting when these tuition increases were approved, that we don't want to price the U of I education to the extent that we keep out the vast majority of our Illinois high school graduates because they can't afford it.
Lawmakers have been pretty critical recently of administrative salaries and professor salaries in the public university systems here in Illinois. Any thoughts on that? Is that warranted? I know some lawmakers say it's hard for me to go home to my district and justify these huge salary costs.
Well, I mean, it's Charlie said you want to attract top talent, and if you want to attract the best educators, to your university, you're obviously going to have to pay them. And but I know that has been something that's been a point of contention, and especially when you look at the level of when you get involved with the University of Illinois being a Big Ten university and coaches' salaries being in millions of dollars. That's that's another thing that kind of rubs some people the wrong way. But when you look at what those coaches generate for universities, it's pretty significant if they're successful and make runs in the tournament and go to bowl games and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think if you want to get good people, obviously. You're going to have to pay them. I mean, and again, like Charlie said, it's the U of I is the flagship school of the state, and it is a world-class institution, and like many of the other colleges before it, land-grant state universities before it. So you want to have a good system.
Well, yeah, I think there's some legitimacy too to some of the criticism. I mean, there's some pretty out-of-line salaries out there, especially when you look at administrators. I mean, take a look at school administrators. Now it's a little off topic, but I mean, we have school administrators making over $400,000 a year in the state of Illinois.
Yeah.
And we talk about unfunded mandates coming down from the state, but it works the other way too. When, say, Niles School District decides to pay their superintendent $400,000, the retirement costs of that superintendent are partially carried by all of the taxpayers
Right.
of the state of Illinois. So that's an unfunded mandate essentially coming back up from the local school district angle. I think we really do have to take a serious look at educator compensation because there's some very out of line salaries out there. In particular, I think it was Representative Chaplavia who pointed out that there's something like 160 superintendents in Illinois making more than the governor.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point,
And
Scott.
I think that's.
But I think something that, people will say that and they'll throw that out and it'll be, oh my God, how can we pay these people so much money? And a lot of the people who make those arguments are the same people who worship at the altar of the free market. And I would point out that it wasn't the state mandating that these superintendents, these lucky 100 and however many there are, be paid these exorbitant salaries. That was a decision made on the local level, because with the exception of 2 school districts in the state of Illinois, one of which is City of Chicago, the other one is the one that's run by the Department of Juvenile Corrections, every other school district, all 800 plus of them, are governed by locally elected boards. And the decision to pay a superintendent a certain amount of money is made by the locally elected board, who, in their collective wisdom, have decided this is what it takes to get this man or woman that we want to be our superintendent, or to keep that person. And so in a sense, it's like the free market at work.
But the flip side of that, though, Charlie, is why should I, for example, I live in Tri-City School District here in Sangamon County. Why should, where the superintendent doesn't make that much money, why should I, as a taxpayer sitting here in Sangamon County, be subsidizing the massive retirement costs that a group of other elected officials that I had no say in are mandating upon me and the rest of the Illinois taxpayers?
Well, and then flip it the other way and say, why should I, a resident of the school district, where I pay income taxes, and 97% of the money for my public schools comes from my property taxes. So my income taxes don't really go to educate my kids. They go to educate the people in districts that aren't as fortunate as we are to have all this property wealth. They go to the low income districts to try and even out the overall burden.
Sure.
So it's, you know, it's basically, in my mind, and this probably sounds too idealistic, it gets down to a community, a commonality. We're all in Illinois. We all should be working together for the betterment of everyone. And if there are some school districts that choose to pay salaries higher because that's what they think that it takes, and if most of the money that pays those salaries comes from local property taxes, I mean, that doesn't really offend me that much.
Well, I think there's also, you know, earlier we were talking, I mean, we started off on the topic on University of Illinois professors and administrators, things like that. I mean, I think it's apples and oranges to compare them to school superintendents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and in looking at the school superintendents, I agree. I mean, you look at some of the salary, you look at the way the pension's set up, and then, you know, you'll have the superintendent who will pull down the $350,000. He retires, takes that pension, then he goes to Arizona or someplace, or in our case, in Quincy, he'd go across the river to some Missouri school district, become a superintendent there, and double dip and do that. That's when, you know, that's the thing that has to be stopped. I mean, you know, it's the double dipping, it's the multiple pensions. I mean, some formula somebody has to take a look at the pensions and just say, look, we're going to cap this at 100,000 or whatever it's going to be, and you can't get more than one pension. You're going to have one pension, and it's going to be this, and no more than that. Whether you make $150,000, $170,000 to be the Quincy superintendent of schools, or $400,000 to be the Niles superintendent.
Well, and we're going to have to end it on that note. Thanks for tuning in this week, and check back next week for more updates. I'd like to thank my guests today, Bob Gough, Charlie Wheeler, and Scott Reeder. And I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues Magazine. Thanks for tuning in.